The war was over. Troy had fallen. Its walls were ash. Its greatest warriors were dead. Across the Aegean Sea, victorious kings raised their sails and returned to their kingdoms. One never did. His name was Odysseus. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. In Ithaca, a queen refused to believe her husband was dead. A young prince grew up without a father. Powerful nobles gathered inside the royal palace, convinced the king would never return. Then stories began spreading across the Mediterranean. Not stories of a defeated king, but of a man still fighting for his life. Some claimed he had escaped a giant that crushed men like insects. Others swore an island's haunting song had driven entire crews into the sea. Every tale sounded more impossible than the last. For nearly 3,000 years, the world dismissed these stories as fantasy. Then one archaeological discovery forced historians to ask a question they never expected. If the city where this journey began was real, was the journey itself hiding a forgotten piece of history? The only person who claimed to know the full story lived centuries after the events were supposed to have happened. His name was Homer. No one knows exactly who he was. Some believed he was a blind poet. Others argued he never existed at all. There are even historians who think Homer was the name given to generations of storytellers rather than one man. That uncertainty created a much bigger problem. If no one could prove the author was real, why should anyone believe his story? For centuries, scholars didn't. They admired the Odyssey as a masterpiece of literature, but treated it the same way they treated fairy tales. Beautiful, unforgettable, and fictional. Then something unusual happened. As archaeologists uncovered more of the Bronze Age, details from Homer's poems kept appearing in the real world. The weapons matched. The palaces matched. Even forgotten kingdoms that had vanished from memory matched. It was becoming harder to dismiss everything as imagination. Still, one question remained unanswered. Had Homer preserved history? Or had history simply inspired an extraordinary storyteller? Long before the Parthenon, before the glory of classical Greece, another civilization ruled the Aegean. Its kings lived in massive hilltop palaces. Their halls overflowed with bronze weapons, gold treasures, and goods carried from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Near East. Hundreds of ships crossed the sea each year, turning the Mediterranean into one of the busiest trade networks on Earth. Then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Cities burned. Palaces were abandoned. Trade disappeared. Writing itself was forgotten. For centuries, the Bronze Age faded into silence, leaving behind little more than broken walls and scattered legends. When Homer's poems were finally written down, they described a world no one could recognize anymore. Most scholars assumed he had invented it. Then, archaeologists uncovered palace after palace buried beneath the earth. The layout, the weapons, the royal courts, even the names of ancient kingdoms. They belonged to the very civilization people once believed had existed only in epic poetry, and hidden among those ruins was one discovery that would change the debate forever. For centuries, Troy existed only in the pages of an ancient poem. Scholars laughed at the idea that an entire city could disappear without leaving a trace. To them, the Trojan War belonged beside myths and legends. Then, in the 19th century, a man ignored the experts. Armed with Homer's descriptions, he traveled to a lonely hill in modern-day Turkey. Convinced the legendary city was buried beneath it, he started digging. Layer after layer, the earth revealed something astonishing. Stone walls, massive gates, ancient homes. Not one city, but the remains of many civilizations, built one on top of another, over thousands of years. One layer showed signs of violent destruction, collapsed buildings, fire, and evidence that people fled in panic. It wasn't proof that every line of Homer's story was true. But it destroyed one powerful assumption. Troy was real. And if Homer had accurately remembered a city lost for centuries, How many other details had survived the journey from history into legend? Finding Troy answered one question. It created an even bigger one. If the city was real, what about the man who supposedly outsmarted it? Unlike Troy, no inscription has ever been found that says, Odysseus lived here. No royal tomb bears his name. No ancient portrait confirms his face. At first, that sounds like the end of the story. Except Bronze Age Greece kept very few records of its kings. Most have disappeared forever, lost when palaces burned and archives turned to ash. Yet, scattered clues remain. Ancient tablets mention powerful rulers governing kingdoms, remarkably similar to those described by Homer. One of those kingdoms was Ithaca, the island Odysseus called home. Suddenly, the question changed. Historians stopped asking whether Odysseus could be proven. They began asking whether he represented a real king whose name, life, and achievements had slowly transformed into legend. Because history doesn't always remember people exactly as they lived. Sometimes, it remembers the story they became. And that possibility leads straight to the island, where the search grows even more mysterious. If Odysseus was real, the answer should begin with his kingdom. Homer called it Ithaca. The island still exists today, rising from the Ionian Sea, just west of mainland Greece. For centuries, people accepted it without question. Then researchers noticed something strange. The mountains didn't quite match Homer's descriptions. Some landmarks seemed to face the wrong direction. The distances between neighboring islands felt off. A few archaeologists proposed a bold idea. What if Homer's Ithaca wasn't today's Ithaca at all? They pointed to another nearby island, arguing that earthquakes and changing coastlines may have altered the landscape over thousands of years. Others rejected the theory completely, insisting the traditional location still made the most sense. The debate continues because neither side has found the one piece of evidence that ends the argument. Yet both camps agree on something remarkable. The world Homer described wasn't invented from nothing. It was rooted in real places, real seas, and real kingdoms. The mystery was no longer whether the journey happened. It was where the journey actually began. The moment Odysseus left Troy, the trail vanished. Homer named islands, coastlines, and distant lands, but almost none can be identified with certainty. For centuries, explorers have tried to retrace the voyage. None have produced the same map. Some place the journey around western Greece. Others stretch it across Sicily. A few believe Odysseus sailed as far as Spain. Each theory solves one mystery and creates another. The descriptions of winds, currents, and sailing times often seem surprisingly realistic. Ancient captains knew the Mediterranean could trap ships for weeks, pushing them hundreds of kilometers off course. A wrong wind wasn't just an inconvenience. It could erase an entire expedition. Suddenly, the voyage no longer looked impossible. It looked unpredictable. And in a sea where every island hid an unknown danger, even an ordinary voyage could become the seed of an extraordinary legend. Then came the story that has fascinated people for nearly 3,000 years. A cave, a giant, and one of history's most unforgettable monsters. The giant wasn't the terrifying part. The cave was, according to Homer, Odysseus and his men entered what looked like an empty shelter, hoping to find food before continuing their voyage. Instead, they found themselves trapped behind a massive stone that no ordinary man could move. Then, the owner returned, a towering shepherd with a single eye. One by one, Odysseus's men were killed as the cave became a prison with no escape. For centuries, the Cyclops has been dismissed as pure fantasy, yet historians notice something curious. Across the Mediterranean, ancient sailors told stories about isolated shepherds living in coastal caves. They also discovered the enormous skulls of extinct dwarf elephants. Their large central nasal opening looked strikingly like the socket of a single giant eye. To people who had never seen such bones before, the explanation seemed obvious. A race of one-eyed giants must have lived here. Was Homer describing a real monster? Probably not. But he may have done something even more fascinating. He could have transformed a forgotten misunderstanding into one of history's greatest legends, and the next mystery was even harder to explain. Sailors who willingly steered their ships toward certain death. No captain feared the open sea as much as the coast. Hidden rocks, violent currents, and narrow channels had destroyed countless ships long before accurate maps existed. Sailors learned to avoid certain places, not because they understood them, but because too many never returned. Homer gave one of those places a voice. The sirens, their song promised knowledge, glory, and everything a traveler longed to hear. Those who followed it never sailed away again. Odysseus chose a different path. He ordered his crew to seal their ears with beeswax and tie him tightly to the mast. No matter how loudly he begged, they were not to set him free. It remains one of the most unforgettable scenes in ancient literature. But many historians believe the sirens were never meant to be magical creatures. They may have been Homer's way of describing deadly coastlines, deceptive winds, or hidden reefs that lured ships into disaster. The legend warned sailors without needing a map. Ignore the warning, and the sea would claim you. Yet even the sirens were not the greatest danger waiting ahead. Two monsters guarded a passage where every choice ended in death. One side of the channel hid Scylla, the other belonged to Charybdis. According to Homer, sailing too close to Scylla meant losing men to a creature that struck from the cliffs above. Move too far away, and Charybdis would swallow the entire sea, dragging ships into a violent whirlpool before spitting out the wreckage. Odysseus faced a choice no leader ever wants to make. Lose a few men, or risk losing everyone. For thousands of years, this scene was treated as fantasy. Then geographers noticed something remarkable. The Strait of Messina, between Sicily and mainland Italy, is famous for dangerous currents, whirlpools, and jagged coastal rocks. Even experienced sailors feared crossing it in ancient times. No sea monster was necessary. Nature itself was terrifying enough. If Homer had turned one of the Mediterranean's deadliest waterways into a battle between monsters, then perhaps his greatest talent wasn't inventing myths. It was transforming real dangers into stories no one would ever forget. And the next stop on Odysseus's journey may reveal why reality often sounded more unbelievable than fiction. After storms, monsters, and impossible choices, Odysseus finally reached an island, unlike any he had seen before. There was no war, no hunger, no fear, only peace. According to Homer, the island belonged to Calypso, a mysterious figure who offered Odysseus something no exhausted sailor could refuse: safety, comfort, and a chance to forget the world he had left behind. He stayed there for years, not because he couldn't sail, but because leaving meant returning to danger. Historians have long questioned whether Calypso was ever meant to be a real person. Some believe she represented powerful rulers who welcomed foreign sailors into wealthy ports. Others see her as a symbol of temptation, the moment when a traveler abandons the difficult road home for an easier life. Whatever the truth, the episode reveals something deeper than mythology. The greatest obstacle on Odysseus's journey wasn't always a monster. Sometimes, it was the quiet temptation to stop moving forward. And that may explain why the final stretch of his voyage became the most dangerous of all. By the time Odysseus left Calypso's island, he had already survived more than most men could imagine. His greatest challenge was still ahead. The Mediterranean has never been a forgiving sea. Without compasses, detailed charts, or reliable forecasts, ancient sailors depended on stars, shifting winds, and experience passed from one generation to the next. One unexpected storm could drive a ship hundreds of kilometers off course. A single broken mast could leave an entire crew drifting for days. Modern historians believe many of Homer's most dramatic episodes may have begun with disasters exactly like these. A shipwreck became the wrath of a god. A violent storm became a divine punishment. A coastline no sailor could escape became the home of a monster. The farther a story traveled, the larger it grew. Yet one question refuses to disappear. If so much of the Odyssey can be traced back to the real dangers of the Bronze Age, why did Homer weave those dangers into a tale of gods, monsters, and miracles, instead of telling history as it happened? By the time Homer's poems were written down, the world they described had already vanished. The great Bronze Age kingdoms had collapsed centuries earlier. Their palaces were ruins. Their kings were forgotten. Most written records had disappeared forever. Stories became the only bridge between the past and the present. But stories don't survive by repeating facts. They survive by being unforgettable. A clever escape becomes a battle with a giant. A deadly current becomes a sea monster. A dangerous coastline begins to sing. The truth isn't erased. It's wrapped in symbols that people remember for generations. That is why historians rarely ask whether every event in the Odyssey happened exactly as Homer described. Instead, they ask a different question. What real memory was each legend trying to protect? And when archaeologists compared Homer's poems with the evidence buried beneath the earth, they found something that neither skeptics nor believers had expected. The line between history and myth wasn't clear at all. When archaeologists, linguists, and historians compared Homer's world with the evidence, a surprising pattern emerged. Not everything matched, but far more matched than anyone expected. The kingdoms were real. The trade routes existed. Bronze Age palaces stood where Homer said powerful rulers once lived. Even weapons, armor, and political alliances described in the poems reflected a world that had disappeared centuries before Homer was born. That doesn't prove gods walked among men. It doesn't prove cyclopes or sirens ever existed, but it does suggest something remarkable. Homer wasn't inventing an ancient world. He was preserving fragments of one. Like a puzzle with missing pieces, some parts remained almost untouched, while others were reshaped by generations of storytellers. The more evidence emerged, the harder it became to dismiss the Odyssey as just a myth. Yet one final question remained. If history and legend had become inseparable, what, exactly, was the real Odyssey? After centuries of debate, the evidence points to a conclusion few people expected. The Odyssey is neither completely true, nor completely fictional. Its monsters almost certainly never existed. Its gods belong to belief, not history. Yet the world beneath those stories was astonishingly real. A powerful city called Troy stood where Homer said it did. Bronze Age kingdoms ruled the Greek world. Ancient sailors crossed dangerous seas with little more than experience, courage, and hope. Some returned home. Others disappeared forever. Those disappearances demanded explanations. Over generations, real storms became the anger of gods. Hidden reefs became monsters. Unfamiliar people became mythical creatures. History slowly transformed into legend. Perhaps that was never meant to deceive anyone. Perhaps it was the only way those memories could survive for 3,000 years. And that leads to one final realization. The greatest mystery of the Odyssey was never whether Odysseus fought monsters. It was why his story still refuses to let us go. 3,000 years later, Odysseus is still sailing, not across the Mediterranean, but through history. Archaeology has revealed enough to prove that Homer's world was rooted in reality. History has shown that Troy was no invention, and the Bronze Age kingdoms were far more than forgotten legends. Yet, the greatest discovery wasn't a buried palace or an ancient city. It was the realization that myths can preserve truth long after facts are forgotten. Perhaps Odysseus was a real king. Perhaps he was several kings, whose stories became one. Or perhaps he was created to represent every sailor who left home, fought impossible odds, and hoped to see familiar shores again. We may never know his true identity. But maybe that's the point. The Odyssey has never been about proving that monsters existed. It's about understanding why people created them, and what they were trying to remember. Sometimes, history survives in stone. Sometimes it survives in stories.